The cops were halfway down my driveway before I even looked up from my power drill. I stood on the edge of my dock well, what's left of it half the planks torn off, the other half stacked behind me. The lake shimmered under the sun, peaceful as ever, until I spotted her blonde bob bouncing behind the officers. Wendy Parkhurst. Of course it was her. She'd been on the HOA board since the beginning of time, and had made it her holy mission to monitor everything within a 5-mile radius of her overpriced lakefront property. She wasn't just on the HOA board, she was the HOA board, as far as she was concerned. "You can't just build unauthorized structures on community property," she yelled, pushing past the cops even though they were still trying to get a word in. "This is a shared body of water. You need an HOA permit and you never submitted one." One of the officers, a younger guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, turned to me. "Sir, is this true? Are you building something without approval?" I wiped sweat off my forehead, set the drill down, and reached into the folder sitting on top of my cooler. "My name's Hayden North. That lake," I pointed behind me. "It's not HOA property, it's not community anything, it's mine. Bought it outright with the land, all of it surveyed and documented. I can show you the deed." Wendy gasped like I'd slapped her with a fish. "You're lying. The HOA owns the lakefront. It's in our bylaws." I handed the officer the paperwork. "Nope, the HOA owns up to the tree line, see here. Everything past that, including the lake and the dock, is mine. The previous owner sold it to me with water rights. I even have the original Reservoir purchase contract from the county." The other officer, an older guy with mirrored sunglasses, took the papers and gave Wendy a long look. "Ma'am, did you verify the property lines before calling this in?" She crossed her arms, lips tight. "I don't need to verify. I know what's in the HOA bylaws." "Ma'am," he said, flipping through the documents, "the county trumps an HOA, and this says Mr. North owns the land and the reservoir. You don't have jurisdiction here. But he's rebuilding a structure without permission. It's his structure on his property." Wendy's face turned the color of a boiled lobster. "He's altering the natural aesthetic of the lake. That affects all of us." "He's violating the spirit of the community," I laughed. I couldn't help it. "The spirit of the community? Wendy, the dock's been falling apart since I moved in. I'm repairing it so I don't break my neck every time I launch my kayak." The younger cop handed my paperwork back. "You're all good, sir." "Sorry to bother you." As they walked back up the driveway, Wendy spun on her heel and jabbed a finger in my direction. "Don't think this is over. The HOA will have something to say about this." I raised an eyebrow. "You already did. And it didn't go well." She stomped off, muttering something about unauthorized lumber as the cops closed her car door for her. I picked up my drill and turned back to the dock. Karen of the lake had just declared war, but I had something she didn't: the law, the land, and receipts. By the following weekend, the new dock was done. Sturdy pine planks, pressure-treated, sealed, and bolted into galvanized brackets. It looked cleaner than anything else on the water, which probably made Wendy even more furious. But I had bigger problems. 3 days after the cops left, a letter showed up in my mailbox. No postage, just folded paper jammed inside an unsealed pink HOA envelope. The bolded header read, "Immediate cease and desist. Unauthorized construction on HOA-designated common access waterways." It was signed by Wendy Parkhurst, HOA chairwoman, and included a threat of daily accumulating fines if I didn't restore the shoreline to its original condition within 72 hours. I didn't bother responding. Instead, I went straight to the county clerk's office and pulled the full plat map again, then marched to my attorney's office. Richard Thorne had been practicing land use law for over 30 years and had a reputation for dismantling overreaching HOAs like a mechanic stripping down a lemon. Richard leaned back in his chair as he flipped through the letter and my documents. "She's bluffing. This isn't just overreach, it's bordering on civil harassment. Can we do anything about it?" He nodded slowly. "Start with a formal cease and desist against the HOA for interference with private property rights. I'll draft it today. If she escalates, we escalate. But I want you to keep a record of everything: letters, emails, even weird stares. The more we document, the better. That same night, my motion-activated trail camera picked up two people walking along the edge of the tree line behind my house. They weren't there long, but one of them was holding a clipboard and taking pictures. I didn't need high resolution to know who it was: Wendy's husband, Charles, and one of the HOA's junior board members, Stacy Geller. They lingered near the dock, pointing at the waterline and whispering, before retreating back through the woods. I printed the footage and dropped it off at Richard's office the next morning. By the time the HOA's monthly meeting rolled around, things had gotten even weirder. My neighbor across the street, Dan, caught me unloading groceries and came over holding a neon orange flyer. "You see this?" he asked, shoving it into my hands. The top read, "Emergency vote annexation of lake for community oversight. They're holding a vote to seize the lake," I asked. Dan nodded. "Wendy's been going door to door saying you're turning it into a rental marina, that you're going to start charging people to launch kayaks." "That's a lie." "Of course it is. But she's got half the neighborhood convinced you're about to build a bait shop and start blasting country music at sunrise." That night, I installed two more cameras, one on the dock, one pointed at the trail behind my house. I wasn't taking chances. The emergency HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a beige brick rectangle that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Reagan administration. I arrived early, sat in the back, and stayed quiet while Wendy stood at the front with a slideshow labeled "Preserving Our Heritage, Protecting Shared Resources." Her voice carried over the hum of the overhead fan. "We must act now to prevent the privatization of what has always been a shared space. If we do not vote to bring the lake under HOA oversight, we risk commercialization, noise pollution, and damage to the natural ecosystem." A few people clapped. Most just looked confused. She clicked to the next slide. It was a zoomed-in photo of me standing on my dock holding a hammer. "This is what unchecked private ownership looks like." I raised my hand. "That's a photo taken without permission on my private property." "Mr. North," she said, not even turning around, "you'll have time to speak after the presentation." "No, I'll speak now." This entire meeting is based on a lie. I stood and held up a folder. I have the deed, the water rights, the original Reservoir purchase contract, and a letter from my attorney stating that any attempt to annex the lake would be considered illegal under state law. I also have trail cam footage of your board members trespassing on my land to take those photos. Murmurs erupted, Wendy's face twitched. "You're disrupting official proceedings." "No, I'm stopping fraudulent ones. The lake was never part of the HOA." "You can't vote to annex something you don't own. That's not democracy, that's theft." One of the older residents stood up. "Is this true? We were told the lake belonged to the community." Another voice, Mrs. Liu, who lived 2 doors down, added, "I've lived here 22 years. The lake's always been private. Even the original brochures said so." Wendy tried to regain control. "We're not stealing anything. We're protecting community interests." Richard had warned me this might happen. I walked to the front and placed a flash drive on the table. "Here's a copy of everything. If you vote for annexation, you're participating in an illegal land grab. And I promise you, every name on that vote will be attached to a class action lawsuit." The room went quiet. Wendy looked toward Charles, who was seated near the snack table. He didn't meet her eyes. By the end of the night, the vote had been postponed indefinitely. Several board members resigned on the spot, but Wendy wasn't done. 2 days later, I came home from work to find a bright red sign posted at the end of my driveway. "This property is under investigation for environmental violations, no entry without authorization." It had the HOA's logo at the top, but no seal from any government agency. I took one photo and called Richard. By the next morning, he'd filed a complaint with the county sheriff and the state environmental agency. Turns out, Wendy had submitted a falsified complaint to the Department of Environmental Quality. claiming I'd dumped toxic materials into the reservoir. She even attached edited photos of old paint cans near the water photos that, when examined closely, had metadata showing they were taken 7 years earlier, before I even bought the property. The state sent an investigator, who found nothing. He even apologized for the inconvenience and confirmed the complaint would be formally dismissed. But Richard wasn't content with that. He filed a formal petition to the county to have the HOA audited for misuse of authority and fraudulent filings. And then something even more interesting happened. A former board treasurer, a woman named Carla who'd moved away 2 years ago, contacted Richard's office. She'd seen the news of the complaint dismissal and wanted to talk. She told us that Wendy had been manipulating HOA funds for years, funneling money into pet projects, awarding contracts to companies owned by relatives, and blacklisting dissenters by fabricating violations. Carla had kept copies of everything. It was enough to trigger a full investigation. The county subpoenaed HOA records. A forensic accountant was brought in. And suddenly, those monthly dues we'd all been paying were under a microscope. I didn't hear from Wendy for a week. When we finally crossed paths again, she was sitting in her car at the end of her driveway, engine running, sunglasses hiding her face. As I walked past with my dog, she rolled the window down just 2 inches. "You think you've won?" she asked, voice thin and cracked. "You have no idea what you've started," I stopped. "That's where you're wrong." I looked her straight in the eye. "I know exactly what I've started. It's called accountability." The county audit hit the HOA like a wrecking ball. Unannounced inspections, mandatory financial disclosures, and a procession of stern-faced investigators rattling off questions at board members who suddenly had trouble remembering anything. Wendy's control, once ironclad, was unraveling by the day, but I wasn't celebrating. Not yet. Because the real storm landed when a sheriff's deputy knocked on my door holding a sealed envelope. "Hayden North?" he asked. I nodded, drying my hands on a dish towel. "You've been listed as a principal witness in a fraud investigation involving the Lakewood Trails HOA. This is a subpoena. You're being called to testify regarding financial misconduct and submission of falsified environmental complaints." I took the envelope and nodded slowly. "Is this about the fake DEQ report?" "That and more," he said. "There's a growing list of charges. You might want to keep your lawyer close." Richard didn't just stay close, he rolled up his sleeves and got to work like he'd been waiting for this his entire career. The county district attorney's office had opened a criminal case, naming Wendy Parkhurst and 2 other board members in a scheme involving embezzlement, document tampering, and filing false regulatory claims. But it went deeper than that. The audit revealed something jaw-dropping. The HOA had been operating an off-the-books maintenance fund. Residents were being charged for non-existent landscaping services money that had been rerouted into a private account under the name Community Harmony Initiative. That account paid for things like luxury hotel stays, catered planning retreats, and even a monthly stipend for executive wellness, which turned out to be a euphemism for Wendy's Pilates membership and spa days. I didn't get involved in the investigation beyond what I was required to do, but word spread fast. Mailboxes were stuffed with copies of subpoena notices. Neighbors who'd once avoided eye contact were suddenly eager to chat over fences. Everyone had a story. Fines for violations that didn't exist, threats of foreclosure over unpaid dues that had already been paid, and one man, a quiet veteran named Joe who lived 2 blocks over, said he'd been denied approval to repaint his shed because Wendy didn't like military colors. I walked with Joe one afternoon down to the edge of the reservoir. He stood there quietly, watching ducks glide through the shallows. "She made me feel like I didn't belong here," he said. "Like I was just tolerated. I paid every fee on time, never caused trouble. Still, she'd send me letters about tone and neighborhood harmony as if I was some kind of threat." "You're not the only one," I said. He looked over. "You think she'll face real consequences?" She's not just in hot water, I said. She's submerged. When the arrest finally happened, it wasn't in some dramatic raid. It was worse for Wendy. It happened during a special HOA meeting she'd insisted on holding one last attempt to reclaim control. She'd called it a return to order. I didn't plan to attend, but Dan knocked on my door that evening. "You're going to want to see this," he said, so I went. The clubhouse was crowded, the air thick with tension and cheap lemons scented air freshener. Wendy stood near the front, attempting to rally what was left of her loyalists. She wore a navy blue blazer and spoke from a stack of pre-written notes. "We must not allow disunity to tear apart what we've built," she said. "The accusations against this board are politically motivated, manufactured by individuals who have a vested interest in chaos and disorder." Somewhere behind me, someone snorted. Then, just as she turned the page, two plainclothes officers entered through the back and walked calmly up the center aisle. They didn't say a word. One held up a warrant. The room fell completely silent. Wendy's voice cracked. "You can't do this. I'm in the middle of a protected civic function." "This is illegal interference," the officer simply said. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for misappropriation of community funds, falsification of public documents, and criminal defamation through state regulatory systems." As they read her rights, her face turned ashen. She didn't resist, but she didn't speak either. Charles stood up from the second row, stunned, then slowly backed away as if distancing himself would erase his involvement. I watched her walk past me in handcuffs, her eyes darting from face to face, searching for anyone who still believed in her. There was no one. The meeting ended in stunned whispers. I stepped outside and stood under the clubhouse awning as rain began to fall. The fallout over the next week was even more chaotic. A temporary receiver was appointed by the court to manage HOA affairs. Emergency meetings were held in actual public buildings this time, under the supervision of a county mediator. Residents were finally given access to the books, and the scale of the abuse became undeniable. Over $80,000 had been misappropriated over 4 years. Dozens of violations had been fabricated to pad the HOA's enforcement success metrics, a stat Wendy used to justify increased dues. 3 homeowners had their properties liened over unpaid fees that, according to bank records, had already been cashed by the HOA. The receiver announced that restitution would be pursued through civil court, and the DA's office confirmed Wendy and 2 others were facing felony charges. I stayed out of the spotlight. But people started knocking on my door asking for advice, thanking me, offering to help rebuild the neighborhood's governance. A few even brought over home-cooked meals, like I'd just returned from war. One afternoon, Carla, the former treasurer who had blown the whistle, showed up carrying a stack of binders. "I figured you might want to see what else was buried," she said. I cleared a space on the dining table and opened the first binder. It was labeled Enforcement Reports 2019. Inside were dozens of forms, each listing an anonymous complaint filed against various residents. "These are all made up?" I asked. She nodded. "Most of them. Wendy used them to justify fines." But only certain people ever got those fines. I flipped through the names. They weren't random. They were people who'd voted against her proposals or who hadn't attended meetings at all. Dissenters and non-participants, the ones least likely to fight back. "She built a system to punish people for not obeying," I said quietly. "She built a system to keep herself in power," Carla replied. The next few months were a blur of hearings, resignations, and restructuring. A new board was elected, one that pledged transparency, community input, and third-party audits. I didn't run for a position. But when they asked me to chair the oversight committee, I said yes, and I made sure of one thing. Every meeting was recorded, every decision documented, every complaint verified and traceable. The lake remained mine. No votes, no bylaws, no more trespassing. But I started hosting monthly cleanup events along the shoreline. People I barely knew started showing up bringing gloves, trash bags, even coolers of lemonade. Kids ran along the edge of the dock I'd rebuilt, tossing pebbles and skipping stones. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the water, Joe stood beside me again, hands in his pockets. "Feels like the neighborhood's breathing again," he said. I nodded. "Took a while." "But yeah," he looked out at the reservoir. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stood your ground that day?" I thought of the police showing up over a dock repair, of forged complaints, secret accounts, and the woman who thought she was untouchable. "Yeah," I said. "All the time." A low rumble of voices echoed through the county courthouse hallway as I stepped off the elevator. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting a dull glow over the tiled floor. I adjusted my tie, more out of habit than nerves. This was the last hearing. After months of depositions, document reviews, and court-appointed audits, the judge would issue the final ruling on the HOA's misconduct and restitution. Richard joined me outside courtroom 3, holding a thick binder under one arm and sipping from a paper cup of burnt coffee. He was wearing the same gray suit he always did for serious matters, the one with the slightly frayed cuffs and the faint mustard stain on the inside lapel. "They're trying to delay again," he said without looking up. "Wendy's new attorney just filed a motion for continuance claiming she's mentally unfit to participate in proceedings." I raised an eyebrow. Convenient timing. She was perfectly fit when she signed off on those vendor kickbacks. The judge isn't going to buy it. "We've got statements from 3 former board members, all under oath, confirming she directed every single decision." The courtroom doors opened and the bailiff called us in. I took a deep breath and followed Richard inside. The hearing was brief. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with steel-rimmed glasses and a voice like gravel, dismissed the motion for delay and immediately moved to final statements. The prosecution laid out the complete timeline, from the falsified environmental reports to the siphoned funds disguised as executive expense reimbursements. When it was Richard's turn to speak, he didn't waste time. "Your Honor, this was not a misunderstanding or a bureaucratic error. This was a targeted campaign of control, retaliation, and personal enrichment. My client, Mr. North, was only one of many victims, but his decision to push back exposed a pattern of abuse that would have otherwise continued unchecked. We are requesting full restitution, criminal penalties under state statute, and the permanent dissolution of the current HOA board." The judge listened carefully, then turned to the defense table. Wendy sat hunched beside her attorney, face pale and expressionless. She didn't speak. She hadn't spoken during any of the hearings. The judge's gavel hit the bench once sharp and final. Restitution in the full amount of $86,427 plus interest is ordered, to be paid back to the HOA General Fund. Additionally, all parties found responsible for fraudulent filings and misuse of funds are hereby banned from serving on any homeowners association board within the state. Criminal charges for falsifying regulatory documents are referred to the district attorney's office for prosecution. The HOA will be placed under court-monitored receivership for a period of 24 months, and the current board is dissolved effective immediately. My hands stayed at my sides, steady. I didn't feel triumph. I felt relief. As we exited the courthouse, the parking lot was half full. The air smelled like fresh-cut grass and hot asphalt. Carla was waiting near her car, a manila envelope tucked under one arm. "I'm headed back to Oregon tomorrow," she said, "but I wanted to give you this. It's the last of the files I kept." Vendor agreements, internal memos, even a few emails where Wendy tried to convince a local developer to partner on a lakeside event space project. I blinked. She was planning to build on the lake, not officially. She pitched it as a community engagement initiative, but the proposal included a lease agreement with a shell company registered in her cousin's name. I took the envelope. "You sure you don't want to stay long enough to see her in handcuffs again?" Carla gave a tired smile. "I've seen enough." You made sure the truth came out. That's more than most people manage. We shook hands and she drove off back home. The neighborhood was different. Not in some sweeping, fairy-tale way. Trash still got blown into yards, dogs still barked at mail carriers, but it was quieter. Lighter. People waved more. Kids played outside without their parents worrying about some phony rule about excessive noise. The temporary HOA receiver, a retired judge named Malcolm, began holding monthly town hall meetings at the local library. Actual votes were taken with paper ballots. Financial reports were read aloud and posted online. And for the first time, residents were involved in shaping their own community. I turned down every offer to be on the board. But I did start volunteering to help residents read their property lines and understand their rights. Wendy had left behind a landscape of misinformation, and it would take time to repair it. One evening, I was out on the dock tightening a bracket on the far edge when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned and saw Joe approaching, his hands in the pockets of a windbreaker. "You hear about the charges?" he asked. I nodded. Grand jury handed down the indictment. Fraud, obstruction, and filing false reports. Could be 5 years in state. She deserve it. I tightened the last bolt and stood up. Deserving doesn't matter. Accountability does. He looked out over the water. Funny how quiet it is now. We stood there in silence for a while, watching the sun dip behind the treetops. The lake glowed gold and silver, undisturbed. No patrols, no clipboard inspections. No threats of fines for the sound of children laughing too loudly. A week later, I received a letter. It was from the county's Office of Environmental Restoration. They were writing to inform me that the false report Wendy filed had triggered a review of the HOA's previous environmental claims. Turns out, the HOA had submitted over a dozen anonymous complaints in the past 5 years, most of which were completely fabricated. Some had even been used to justify raising dues for emergency remediation. The county had opened a formal fraud investigation and planned to pursue back penalties and potential criminal charges against the former board treasurer and secretary. I forwarded the letter to Richard, who called me not long after. "This is going to be a landmark case," he said. "Might actually force the state to rework how HOAs are monitored." "Good," I said. "Let them make an example out of her." And they did. The trial took place 6 months later. Wendy was found guilty on multiple counts and sentenced to 3 years in state prison, with an additional 5 years of probation. The judge stated plainly that her actions had eroded public trust and weaponized a community institution for personal gain. The day she was taken into custody, no one cheered. There were no celebrations, just a quiet understanding that something toxic had been removed. I didn't attend the sentencing. Instead, I spent the day with a group of neighbors planting native grasses along the shoreline to prevent erosion. Someone brought sandwiches. A kid fell in the mud and laughed so hard he couldn't get up. Later that evening, I sat on the dock with a thermos of coffee and watched the water. A family of otters had moved into the far end near the reeds. They tumbled and splashed, completely unaware of what the land had gone through. The lake was still mine. But now the neighborhood was ours again. And finally, it felt like it was worth being part of.